Hello guys, in this part I want to talk about the upper gastrointestinal tract or the upper GI tract. The upper GI tract consists of the oral cavity and the structures which we have in the oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and a small part of duodenum. It's where the initial mechanical and chemical processing of the ingested material take place. And I will start from the oral cavity for you. In the oral cavity, we have mechanical digestion, which we call it mastication. It starts from the oral cavity. We have secretion of saliva from the salivary gland in response to food being present within the oral cavity. We have mixing of the ingested material and the saliva, and we have a wet mass which we call it bolus. And this bolus move through the pharynx to go to the esophagus. The next part is called pharynx. The pharynx is a funnel-shaped tube which the bolus is moved into to go to the esophagus. Mucus secreted in saliva and also in the superior part of the pharynx. So the bolus is lubricated enough to pass this tube and enter the next part, which we call it esophagus. The esophagus is a long tube, and the bolus transported from the pharynx in the esophagus to reach the stomach. The esophagus is lubricated by the mucous secretion. The next part is the stomach. The bolus is mixed with the gastric secretion as the muscularies in the stomach start to go to contraction. These secretions are released into the stomach lumen by the epithelial cells of the stomach. We have secretion of mucosa, we have secretion of acid, and we have secretion of digestive enzyme. The mixing continues as the acidic puree is called chyme, and the chyme can move to the intestine. I told you that the duodenum is the part of our upper GI tract, but I will discuss about it in the small intestine. Now about the oral cavity. The oral cavity or mouth is the entrance of our GI tract. We have two distinct regions in our oral cavity. One part is called vestibule and the other part is called oral cavity proper. The vestibule is the space which we have between the gum, lips, and cheeks. And the oral cavity proper is located central to our teeth. This is the part where our tongue is located. And the oral cavity is protected by cheeks from both sides and by the lips from the anterior. And I will talk about these parts for you. First, look at this picture. In this picture, you can see the cheeks. The cheeks can make the lateral wall of the oral cavity. Externally, they are covered by the skin, and internally, they are covered by the mucous membrane. Between the skin and mucous membrane, we have the skeletal muscle, which we call it vaccinator muscle. Contraction of this muscle can squeeze the food or everything which we have in our oral cavity. The next part is called lips. The lips can make the anterior part of our oral cavity, the anterior entrance of our oral cavity. As you see in this picture, the lips has reddish hue from outside. This is due to the superficial blood vessels, and the skin in this part, specifically the keratin in this part, is very, very thin. So we can see red color in the external surface of our lips. Internal surface of the lips is made up of the mucous membrane, and as you see here, it can attach to gingiva. When we have this attachment in the midline, you can see a mucous fold. This mucous fold is called labial phrenoloma. I talked about the vestibule and oral cavity proper. This cavity, which you have between your lips and your cheeks and the teeth, is called vestibule, and this cavity, which you have your tongue inside between the teeth, is called oral cavity proper. The next part which we have in our oral cavity is the palate. This is the palate. The palate is the roof of oral cavity or the floor of our nasal cavity. The palate can separate oral cavity from nasal cavity, and we have two parts in the palate. The anterior part of the palate is composed of bones. We call it hard palate, and the posterior part is muscular, and we call it soft palate. You know that your hard palate is composed of two bones. We have horizontal plate of palatine bone, process of the maxilla, which can make our hard palate. And as I told you, the soft palate is composed of muscle and the mucous membrane. We have one finger-like projection which is suspended from the soft palate. We call it uvula, and the uvula has function at the time of swallowing. If you look at this picture, again, you can see the hard palate here. The anterior two-thirds of the palate is the hard palate. I told you that the palatine process of maxilla and horizontal plate of palatine bone can make the hard palate. We have some transverse palatine folds, which we call them palatine rugae in the hard palate, and it's important for manipulating material. It can help our tongue to manipulate the bolus. And this part is called soft palate, and you see the uvula, which is the conical or finger-like projection from the posterior part of soft palate. The uvula elevates with the soft palate when we want to do swallowing. It can close the entrance of our nasal cavity from the posterior part of our oral cavity. If the uvula doesn't go up, then we have entrance of food into our nasal cavity. The next term which I want to tell you is fauces. Look at here. The fauces is the opening between oral cavity and our oropharynx. The fauces is bounded by two muscular folds. The anterior fold is called palatoglossal arch, and the posterior fold is called palatopharyngeal arch. Between these two arches, we can see tonsil. This tonsil is called palatine tonsil. And you see that we have two palatine tonsil in right and left side. The tonsil is the first line of defense against any pathogens which come to our oral cavity. The next structure is the tongue. Here you can see the tongue. The tongue has two surfaces. One surface is called posterior surface, and one surface is called inferior surface. The posterior surface of our tongue is full of papilla. You can see many ridges on the surface of your tongue. We call them lingual papilla. They are projections, and we have different types of papilla. Some of these papilla contains taste bud, and they can sense the taste of food. Some of these papilla can help the bolus to go backward. So some of them work mechanically and some of them work chemically. The inferior posterior surface of the tongue is completely smooth, and we don't have any papilla there. And as you see in this picture, this inferior surface can attach to the floor of our oral cavity by a mucous fold, which we call it lingual frenulum. So the lingual frenulum can do this attachment. Again, in this picture, you can see the posterior surface of the tongue full of papilla, and also in the tip of tongue, we have many papilla too. And here you can see the inferior surface. The inferior surface is completely smooth, and you can see the lingual frenulum, which can attach our tongue to the floor of our oral cavity. And this is the other view, the lateral view of your tongue. This is the tongue, and you need to know that your tongue is composed of skeletal muscles. These skeletal muscles are located in different orientation, so you can move your tongue in different direction. The posterior surface of your tongue is not as smooth, but the inferior surface is completely smooth. In the last part of our tongue, in the posterior part of the tongue, we have many lingual tonsils. The number of lingual tonsils are numerous. And you need to know that your tongue is attached to the bone, which we call it hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is located in our cervical region, and this is the only bone in our body without any connection and joints with the other bones. So here you can see the oral cavity, your tongue, the hard palate, the soft palate, and the uvula, which is suspended here. Pay attention. In the back of our oral cavity, we have pharynx. The pharynx is a funnel-shaped tube, and it has three different parts. You can see nasopharynx in the superior region. Then we have oropharynx in the middle region, and after that, we have laryngopharynx in the inferior region. The cavity of our mouth and also our pharynx is covered by non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And this stratified squamous epithelium can protect against abrasion and different problems which may happen in our mouth cavity. It's non-keratinized in human, and also mammals, but in some animals like mice, rats, rabbits, they contain keratin. But you need to know that the outer side of your lips and also the outer side of your cheeks has keratin. We have some keratinized region in our hard palate too. The next part is about the salivary glands. The salivary glands can produce saliva. They are located inside and outside of our oral cavity. Some of these salivary glands are called intrinsic salivary glands. They are located within the oral cavity. They only contain one cell, so we call them unicellular gland. And continuously they can release secretion. They are independent to the food, and they can make our mouth cavity wet all the times. These intrinsic salivary gland can secrete lingual lipase, and this lipase can start digestion of lipids from our mouth cavity. The amount of this lipase which is secreted here is very little, so it doesn't do many digestion of our lipids and fats, but it starts this digestion. And we have a group of salivary glands which we call them extrinsic salivary gland, and they can produce most of the saliva which we have. They are classified as parotid, submandibular, and sublingual salivary gland. In this picture, you can see the location of them. This is the parotid salivary gland. It's located anterior and inferior to our ear, and this is the biggest salivary gland. but it cannot make the large amount of saliva. After that, you can see the submandibular salivary gland, which is located beneath the mandible, and sublingual salivary gland, which is located beneath our tongue. The parotid salivary gland, I told you that, is the largest. And about 25 to 30% of the saliva is produced by this gland. From this gland, we have a duct, which we call it parotid duct, to the oral cavity. This parotid duct extends from the gland across the masseter and open near the second upper molar tooth, which I will show it to you later. We have some infection of the parotid gland with the viruses, and it can make a disease which we call it mumps. And most of us were vaccinated against mumps by the vaccine which we call it MMR. The MMR vaccine can immune us from 3 important viral diseases: mumps, measles, and rubella. The next salivary gland which we have is, this is the parotid duct. It passes the masseter and enter to our oral cavity, and as you see here, it opens at the second molar. The next salivary gland, as you see here, is called submandibular salivary gland. They are inferior to the floor of our oral cavity, and it's located medial to our mandible. Because of that, we call it submandibular. The large amount of saliva, about 60 to 70% of the saliva, is made by submandibular salivary gland. We have a duct, which we call it submandibular duct, which can bring this saliva into the floor of our oral cavity on both sides of the lingual frenulum. And the next salivary gland is called sublingual salivary gland. It's located inferior to our tongue and medial and anterior to the submandibular salivary gland. We have a duct from this gland, which we call it sublingual duct, and it can be open to the cavity of our mouth. About 3 to 5% of the saliva is made by sublingual salivary gland. So these are the different salivary glands which we have in our oral cavity. Pay attention, we have 2 types of cells in our salivary gland. One type of cell is called mucose, and the other one is called serous. So we have mucose and serous cell. The mucose cell can secrete mucin. The mucin is the thick substance. It's a viscous substance, and it can do lubrication of our mouth cavity. The mucin is forming with mucose and water. When mucose and water combine together, they can make mucin. And the serous is a watery secretion, which is secreted by the salivary gland. It contains electrolyte and amylase. The amylase is the enzyme which can start digestion of carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate which we have here is called amylose. In these submandibular, sublingual, and parotid salivary gland, we have different number of mucose cell and serous cell. But before I start talking about them, look at the mucose and serous cell here. These cells, which you can see in whitish color, are mucose, and the cells which are reddish or pinkish are serous cell. So these are serous, and this is the mucose. In the submandibular salivary gland, we have both mucose and serous, but the ratio of serous is more than mucose, so it's more red. In the sublingual salivary gland, we have both mucus and serous, but the number of mucus are more. So the color of this gland in histology is more whitish. And you need to know that the parotid salivary gland is completely serous. So you can see it completely red or pink. So the submandibular and sublingual are mixed with different ratio of mucus and serous cells, but the parotid salivary gland is completely composed of serous cells. Each day, we have secretion of 1 to 1.5 liter of saliva, and most of the saliva is produced during our mealtime. 99% of the saliva is water, and we have a mixture of different solutes in our saliva too. We have amylase, mucin, and lysozyme in our saliva. The amylase can break down carbohydrate, the mucin can lubricate the surface for us, and the lysozyme can break down pathogens if there is any pathogen in our food. When ingested food is moistened with saliva, we can have a wet globular structure, which we call it bolus. And in the bolus, we have initiation of amylase function. The amylase start to break down carbohydrate and starch, and it can make a simpler carbohydrate. Food molecule dissolved here, so taste receptors stimulated in this region in our oral cavity. The saliva can clean our oral cavity structure, and you see that the animals lick their babies. By this licking, they want to clean their babies with their saliva because we have many lysozyme in the saliva. In the saliva, we have many antibacterial substances which can inhibit bacterial growth, specifically on the surface of our teeth. As I told you, we have lysozyme and different types of antibodies. Now I want to talk about the regulation of salivary secretion. You need to know that the salivary nuclei are located in our pons, in our brainstem, in the middle of brainstem, which we call it pons. And this salivary nuclei can regulate the salivation. The basal level of salivation is giving response to parasympathetic stimulation. When you are in the state of rest and digest, you have more saliva secretion. When you are sleeping, you see that some babies have drooling. It means that the amount of saliva which is secreted increase. And when you are afraid of something, at that time, your mouth becomes dry. It means that at the time of sympathetic stimulation, secretion of saliva decrease. In our oral cavity and also a stomach, we have some receptors which can stimulate secretion of saliva. They detect different food, and then we have secretion of saliva at that time. When they detect food, they can send signals to the salivary nuclei in our pons. And then these signals are received by the higher brain center. And then we have increased sympathetic output to the salivary gland, and the secretion of saliva increase. You need to know that these parasympathetic neurons are located in our facial nerve, or nerve number 7, which can innervate the submandibular and sublingual salivary gland, and also in nerve number 9, or glossopharyngeal nerve, which can innervate our parotid gland. So these glands start to secrete their saliva. And as I told you, sympathetic stimulation during exercise can decrease the amount of saliva. Now you can answer this question. What are the main functions of saliva? You know that the saliva can clean your mouth and oral cavity. It can inhibit bacterial growth. It can act as a watery medium, which we have a start of action of the enzyme like amylase, and also it can moisten ingested food and make bolus for us. The next part is about our teeth. And you know that your teeth can do mechanical digestion. And the first mechanical digestion which we have here is called mastication or chewing. Mechanical digestion in the oral cavity is called mastication or chewing, as you see here in this slide. It requires the coordinated activity of our teeth, a skeletal muscle in our lips, tongues, cheek, and jaw. All of them are controlled by the nuclei which are located in our medulla oblongata and also our pons. This region is called Mastication Center. Some medications like nitroglycerins can be placed under the tongue where they pass through the epithelium by simple diffusion. We don't need to chew them. And easily it can absorb to our blood stream. The teeth are collectively known as dentition. And now I want to show you a teeth structure and different parts which we have in our teeth. You need to know that the teeth is responsible for the process of mastication. Now look at this picture. In this picture, you can see the different parts which we have for each teeth. The teeth has the exposed part which we call it crown. The crown of teeth is white. Then we have the next part which we call it constricted neck. And after that, you can see the next part which is root and it's embedded in our jaw. The root of the teeth fit tightly in the dental alveoli. I hope you remember the tooth socket or in the alveolar process of the mandible and maxilla. They are the locations where the root of our teeth can be placed. The root of the teeth are connected to the bone of the jaw with some ligaments. Look at here, you can see many of these ligaments in a very light blue color here. We call them periodontal ligament. This periodontal ligament can make a joint between root of our tooth and the jaw, which we call it gum fossis. And I hope you remember the gum fossis is the joint without any movement. The major part of our teeth is made up of dentin. The dentin is similar to the bone in its structure, but it's harder than the bone. On the external surface of the dentin, we have a whitish part which we call it enamel. The enamel is the hardest material which we have in our body, and about 99% of the enamel is composed of hydroxyapatite crystal. And you know that the hydroxyapatite crystal is responsible for hardening of the bone. So you can see most of this crystal in the enamel of your tooth. In the center of each teeth, we have a region which we call it pulp cavity, which contains pulp. Pulp is a soft gelatinous tissue and it's full of nerve, blood vessel, and lymph vessel. The next part is called root canal. The root canal is very similar to the pulp cavity, but it's located in the root of our teeth. And as you see here, it contains that gelatinous material and the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve here. At the end of this root canal, you can see the opening here. This opening is called apical foramen, and actually through this apical foramen, the branches of the blood vessels and nerves can come to our teeth. The root of our teeth externally are covered by a very strong material, which we call it cementum. We have two types of teeth. One type is called milk teeth or deciduous, and the other type is called permanent teeth. First, we have deciduous teeth. It starts to erupt between 6 months to 30 months after birth, and we have 20 teeth here. And after that, these teeth are replaced by the permanent teeth, which is 32 teeth. And now I want to show you all of them. The last teeth which come up and erupt in our oral cavity is called wisdom teeth. In this picture, you can see the structure of the deciduous teeth, the teeth which we have in the babies and in the kids. We have 20 teeth in this dentition, and you need to know that in each half of the jaw we have 2 incisor teeth. The incisor teeth are like chisel and they have only one root. They are designed for slicing or cutting the food into small pieces. After these 2 incisor, we have 1 canine. The canine is responsible for puncturing and tearing food. And after that, you can see 2 molar. So we have 2 incisor, 1 canine, and 2 molar in deciduous teeth. The molar are specialized for grinding and crushing ingested food. In the permanent teeth, between the canine and the molar, we have 2 other teeth which we call them perimolar teeth. Like the molar, the perimolar are responsible for grinding and crushing. And we have 32 teeth in this dentition. Pay attention, we have 2 incisor, 1 canine, 2 perimolar, and 3 molar in this dentition. And now you can answer this question. What are the name of the teeth from the most anterior to the most posterior? First, we have incisor, then we have canine. After that, we have perimolar, and then we have molar teeth. The next part is about our pharynx. The pharynx is the funnel-shaped tube. I told you about it. And the pharynx has 3 parts. We have nasopharynx, oropharynx, and hypopharynx or laryngopharynx. This funnel-shaped muscular tube is the passageway for both air and food. And we have muscular wall around this part. These muscles can go to contraction, and by their contraction, they can propel the food in the inferior part of our GI tract. The pharynx is lined by non-keratinized stratified squamous, and this epithelium can protect it against different abrasion. After the pharynx, we have esophagus. The esophagus is normally collapsed. And this is a tube which starts from the pharynx and attached to the stomach. Look at here. This is the structure of esophagus. The esophagus starts from the cricoid cartilage in our larynx, come down in our mediastinal cavity, then it perforates the diaphragm. This perforation is called esophageal hiatus and enter the abdominal cavity. In the abdominal cavity, it's only 1 to 1.5 centimeter in its length, and then it attached to the stomach. We have two sphincters for our esophagus. One sphincter is located between pharynx and the esophagus, which we call it superior esophageal sphincter, and the other sphincter is located between the esophagus and the stomach, and we call it inferior esophageal sphincter, or the other name of inferior esophageal sphincter is cardiac sphincter 2. Pay attention, the sphincter is the thicker inner circular muscle in the tunica muscularis, and contraction of this muscle can control the entrance and exit of material from each part of our digestive system. In this picture, you can see again the upper or superior esophageal sphincter. The superior esophageal sphincter is a contracted ring of circular skeletal muscle at the superior end of the esophagus. It is the area where the esophagus here and the pharynx here are meet each other. This sphincter is closed during inhalation, and the air cannot come to the esophagus when we want to inhale. And instead of that, the air can go to the trachea. The next sphincter is called inferior esophageal sphincter or lower esophageal sphincter. This is a contracted ring of circular smooth muscle. Pay attention, the upper one or the superior one is the skeletal muscle, while the inferior one is the smooth muscle. This sphincter is not strong enough to prevent refluxing back from the stomach to the esophagus. Because of that, we have the muscle of diaphragm, which can help the lower esophageal sphincter to prevent backflow or regurgitation of the food from the stomach to the esophagus. The lower esophageal sphincter in normal situation can help the bolus to come to the stomach, and in normal and healthy cases, we should not have backflow from the stomach to the esophagus, because the material which we have in the stomach is full of acid, and this acid can hurt the wall of our esophagus. This regurgitation can make a problem which we call it heartburn. The esophagus is lined by non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The tunica submucosa in the esophagus is thick, and it's full of elastic fibers. These elastic fibers can help the elasticity of this tube. So when the bolus is in the esophagus, it becomes distended, and when the bolus passes, it again goes back to the normal shape. And also we have many glands here, many mucous glands, which can lubricate the surface of the esophagus. And pay attention, in the muscularis externa of the esophagus, we have two types of muscles. In the 1/3 of the esophagus, the muscle is a skeletal muscle. In the second 1/3, we have mix of a skeletal muscle and a smooth muscle, and in the last 1/3, it is only a smooth muscle. So the muscularis in the esophagus is composed of a skeletal and a smooth muscle. In the upper part, it's only a skeletal. In the lower part, it's only a smooth. In the middle part, it's the mix of a skeletal and a smooth muscle. And pay attention, the outermost layer of esophagus is tunica adventitia. It is not tunica serosa. Look at this picture. In this picture, you can see the esophagus. And I want to show you the different parts. First, you need to know that we have a cavity here which we call it lumen. This is the lumen where the food is located. After the lumen, you can see this this blue arrow. This blue arrow represents tunica mucosa. The tunica mucosa is composed of first epithelium, then lamina propria, and after that we have muscularis mucosa. Then you can see the red arrow. The red arrow here can show you the tunica submucosa. This is the areolar to dense irregular connective tissue, and in this part we have many blood vessels, lymphatic follicle, nerve, and lymphatics. After that, you can see the black arrow. The black arrow here represents tunica muscularis externa. Tunica muscularis externa has inner layer which is circular and outer layer which is longitudinal muscle. And the last layer, which is in green color here, is called tunica adventitia. So from the start to the end, you can see tunica mucosa, tunica submucosa, tunica muscularis externa, and tunica adventitia at the end. The movement of the bolus in our esophagus has different stages. The swallowing process is called deglutition, is the process of moving ingested material from the oral cavity to our stomach. And this process has three different phases. The first phase is called voluntary phase. Then we have pharyngeal, and the last one is called esophageal phase. And now I want to show you these phases in the pictures. First, about the first phase, which we call it voluntary phase or voluntary stage. The voluntary phase occurs after ingestion. When the food comes to the mouth cavity, the voluntary phase starts. It's controlled by the cerebral cortex, mostly the temporal lobe and some parts of the frontal lobe. Ingested material and saliva mix together in our oral cavity. The chewing can form a bolus that is mixed and manipulated by our tongue, and then our tongue push this bolus against the palate, and then the bolus go posterior, as you see here, and it wants to go to our pharynx, to the oropharynx. When it wants to move to the oropharynx, the next stage, which we call it pharyngeal phase, starts. The arrival of the bolus at the entryway to the oropharynx can initiate the pharyngeal phase. The pharyngeal phase is involuntary, so we don't have any control on that. The tactile receptors, which we have in the pharynx, become stimulated, and at that time, the uvula go up and close the entrance of our nasal cavity, so the bolus cannot go to the nose. Then the bolus come to the oropharynx and come down. When it comes down, it has two ways. One of them is trachea and the other one is the esophagus. At that time, the epiglottis, which is the cartilage in our pharynx, come down and close the entrance of our trachea. And the only way where the bolus can go is to the esophagus. All of this process can be regulated in the center, which we call it swallowing center or deglutition center, which is located in our medulla oblongata. So in this phase, we have entry of the bolus into the oropharynx, as you see here, elevation of soft palate and uvula to block the passageway between the oropharynx and the esopharynx. And then the larynx, the epiglottis of the larynx come up and close the entrance of the trachea so the bolus cannot go down to our trachea. So it comes to the esophagus. Pay attention when you talk and eat, when you eat and cry, when you are nervous, this process become confused, and sometimes the bolus can go to our trachea and choking can happen. Or in the babies, in the infants, when they cry and we try to feed them, the milk can go to their nasal cavity and comes out of their nose at the time of feeding and crying. So this stage is called pharyngeal stage. And then next stage is called esophageal stage. The esophageal stage is the involuntary stage. It's the time during which the bolus passes through the esophagus and come into the stomach. It takes about 5 to 8 seconds. The presence of the bolus in the lumen of our esophagus can initiate peristalsis movement. Peristalsis movement can help the bolus come down, as you see here. It comes down until it reaches the lower or inferior esophageal sphincter. It's like knocking at the door. The bolus knock on the sphincter becomes stimulated, it becomes open and help the bolus to come to the stomach. We call it esophageal phase. In normal situation, after the bolus come to the stomach, this sphincter should completely close so that we don't have any backflow or any regurgitation from the stomach to the esophagus. So you see that the swallowing these different steps. Sometimes we have this regurgitation. This regurgitation can make inflammation of esophagus due to the acidic nature of the content of our stomach, and it can make heartburn. This is a pain in the back of our sternum. Overweight individuals, smokers, and sometimes when we eat large meal, we can have this heartburn. And sometimes we have a hernia, which we call it hiatal hernia. This is a time when the diaphragm become ruptured and the stomach come up and pass the diaphragm. For prevention of heartburn, we need to change our lifestyle. Head elevation and limiting meal size can decrease the heartburn. Now you can answer this question. What movement, which is part of the pharyngeal phase, blocks the movement of material from the oropharynx to the nasopharynx? As I told you, when the soft palate and uvula come up, they can close the nasopharynx and they don't let the bolus to go to the nasopharynx and our nasal cavity. I will talk about the stomach in the next video.